Hi, this is Mori reporting from Berlin, and in this video I want to show you how to build the periodic table of elements using React and CSS Grid. So stay tuned. So for this video we will be using this periodic table JSON file that you can find online on GitHub. I will share the link in the description. And this JSON file just has all the data we need about all the elements in the periodic table. And then we will also be using Create React app, which is a simple tool, CLI tool for Node that you can use to set up a React application quickly. And I just did this. I copied the JSON file into my source directory, and that's all that we need for this one. So this is how our application currently looks like. And if I look at the code, then you can see this is my app component. It just renders some text here, the periodic table component that we'll be building from scratch in this video, and a video component that I am using to record myself here for this video. So I created these two files, the periodic table.js, the component. It currently just renders a div with the class name periodic table, and it imports the periodic table CSS file that we will be using to style this table. Also in my directory you will find this periodic table JSON file that I have mentioned earlier, which we will be using to build this periodic table. And before we get started, let's talk about the periodic table itself. And if I look at the screenshot here, or this image on Wikipedia, then you can see that the periodic table is basically a grid. It has like 18 columns and it has 7 or more rows. And the special thing about this grid is, for example, in the first row, there's a huge gap between like hydrogen and helium. And how would we solve this in with CSS? And the solution for that is basically in our data itself. And if you look at the data, for example, at hydrogen, then you can see that there are these two properties, xpos 1 and ypos 1, and it just describes the position of this element on the periodic table on this grid. And the thing now that we have to do is basically set up a CSS grid and assign each of these elements to the respective position on that grid using the xpos and ypos properties on this JSON file. So now let's get started by rendering every element in the periodic table inside of the periodic table component that we have here. And to do that, we have to import the entire JSON file. We have copied to our directory by saying import data from periodic table JSON.json. So this will import the entire JSON file. And now I want to render a div for each element in this JSON file. To render a div for every element in my JSON file here, I just have to say data.elements, because all of the elements are in this elements array inside of this JSON file. I have to say data.elements map, and for each element here inside of that JSON file, I want to return a div, and I want the content of that div to be the symbol name of that element. And because we are in React here, I have to also assign a key for every element in this data array, otherwise React will complain. And the key of each div is going to be the element's name. And if I save that and go to my browser here, then you can see I have a list of all the elements in my application. Now I want to render all of these elements inside of a CSS grid, and to do that I have to go back to my code and create a style for this periodic table class name. And I will do that by going to my periodic table CSS file, and here I want to say for the class name periodic table, I want to define following styles. I want it to be a grid, so I have to say display grid. And I want that this grid has 18 columns, because I know the periodic table has 18 columns. And to do that, I have to say grid template columns, and I have to say repeat 18. So repeat 18 times width of 64 pixels. So this is going to be the width and height of each element inside of our grid. And I also want to have 7 rows inside of my grid. And to do that, I have to say grid template rows, repeat 7 rows with the height of 64 pixels. And if I save that, and you will see that we have this kind of grid. It is not really centered, so I will just quickly center it inside our application by saying position absolute, top 50%, left 50%, and transform translate minus 50%, minus 50%. This is just a little trick to center stuff with CSS. And now you can see we have a centered grid in our application, but still we have this problem that there is no gap between hydrogen and helium like it should be here. And we're gonna fix that right now. So now we want to position each element correctly here on this periodic table by making use of the data we have. We know in which column and in which row each element should be. But now we have to connect this information with the CSS grid that we have. And to do that, we just have to go back to our application and go to the div that we're rendering for each element. And we have to now assign a style property for each element and assign a column and a row for each element that we have here. And to do that, we just have to say grid column. So this will assign a column for that element in our CSS grid, and we have to say element dot expos. So this will say this element should go to that grid column based on the expos property of that element. And we have to do the same for grid row. So I want that this element goes to the row based on element.ypos. And if I save that, you will see that we already have a pretty good looking shape of our periodic table. We still have this special case of this like extra rows here that we didn't cover when defining our grid, but we will fix that soon. So if you look at the JSON file that we have here, you can see that there are certain elements which have the ypos value of 10. And this just means that this data has a total of 10 rows for the periodic table, and we have to increase the amount of rows that we are specifying here in our grid from 7 to 10. And by increasing this from 7 to 10, the grid will look a bit better, and the CSS grid will know, okay, these rows should also have a height of 64 pixels. And now what we want to do is style the elements a bit, make them like box shaped and so on. So in case you're wondering what these extra 2 rows are, I'm not a chemist, but these 2 rows are actually like an expanded view of this slot we have right here. So all of these elements are in this spot, and all of these elements are in this spot. So they're just like extracted in this like in these like extra rows that we have here. So I actually decided to fast forward here and not talk about the styling of each element here in the periodic table. The main point of this video is just the connection between the data that we have and the CSS grid, and I think we did that already. So we can find everything that I did for the periodic table on GitHub. I even added this like color map for like certain groups in the periodic table. Yeah, I'm showing the symbol, the atomic number of each element, and the element name here. And yeah, I hope you learned a thing or two about CSS Grid, and I hope you agree that it is actually much easier to have this periodic table or to build this periodic table than you think. So yeah, thank you for joining me, and have a nice day. Bye.